Lakeside is pleased to sponsor this exciting broadcast featuring Dr. Sandra Bloom and Sarah Yanosy on Voice America.
Welcome to Creating Presence with your hosts, Dr. Sandra Bloom and Sarah Yanosy. Over the next hour, you'll learn about the processes that steer our hearts and minds and how to improve our collective social health.
Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my colleague, Sarah Yanosy.
Hello, everyone.
Sarah and I have developed an organizational intervention to help organizations integrate trauma-informed practice using the acronym PRESENCE. It stands for Partnership and Power, Reverence and Restoration, Emotional Wisdom and Empathy, Safety and Social Responsibility, Embodiment and Enactment, Nature and Nurture, Culture and Complexity, and Emergence and Evolution. In today's podcast, we're looking at each of the, in the whole of the podcast, we're looking at each of the letters of the acronym, and we're talking with people who, from a variety of areas, who can help us expand our thinking and our work to improve what we think of as collective social health. Today, we're going to focus on the third E in the acronym, and it stands for Emergence and Evolution. And we're going to take a deeper dive into this topic with the focus on our social health being on the future. Where do we go from here?
So we should probably define what we mean by emergence and evolution. And I will take the emergence part because it's kind of my favorite. Emergence really is about what comes out of the process of change. And so that means really thinking about the future. And in our model, Sandy, you and I talk a lot about the 4 domains that really get disrupted for people who have experienced trauma or who are facing adversity or chronic stress. And those are safety, emotions, loss, and future. And what we have found time and time again is that people who have had traumatic experiences really struggle with all 4 of those pieces, but they often can't even access the will to make changes to their capacity for safety or to manage their emotions or to grieve the losses that they've had if they don't have a sense of future, if they don't have something tangible or a vision to hold on to even motivate them. And it's hard to trust that there might be a better future after you've experienced a traumatic loss or, a trauma experience, because the betrayal involved in interpersonal trauma and, just the overwhelming emotional experience makes it hard to think about what comes next or even that there might be a next. And so this idea of emergence really hinges on our capacity for hope. And I think a lot about emergence as borrowing hope. As a therapist and as a coach working with our organizations, I lend hope often. I will be the one to sort of hold on to hope when people I'm serving can't get there yet. But as a human being, I also really rely on the people around me sometimes as sources of hope, and I have to borrow hope from other people.
Well, I'll take the evolution part of it. And the reality is that all living things evolve. And there was a cool book from the 70s called Earth. And one of the quotes from that is, "Life depends on the environments in which it evolved and to which it has adapted." And that really becomes a huge problem for us as human beings because we are so adaptive. We adapt even to really adverse conditions really quickly. And then as soon as we do that, we think of those conditions as being normal. Right. And whatever is normal, we resist changing. So we see that resistance to change today everywhere. among people who have been hurt, which is pretty much everybody. And it means that as a whole society, we've adapted to situations that are really self-harming at home, in organizations, and in society as a whole. So that's what we want to talk about with our guests today. I'm really happy to introduce one of my longtime colleagues and friend, Christine Courtois. Chris is one of the founders of the field of trauma-informed care, going all the way back to her first book in 1988, Healing the Incest Wound. At the same time that I was running my inpatient unit, Chris was doing the same, and sharing insights with her over the years was really important to my growth and development. And she helped to develop the conceptual framework for complex PTSD and has received many honors and awards for a lifetime of work. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Sandy. It's a delight to be with you. And just so everybody knows, you've been as influential on me as I've been on you. So I'm delighted to join you today and to talk about complex trauma.
Chris, what's important for our listeners to know about complex trauma, specifically how it's treated and what happens in that evolution from traumatic injury to recovery?
Okay. Complex trauma is important to know about because, first of all, it is interpersonal. And that means that it is has been caused or perpetrated by another human being. And because of that, it has betrayal dimensions to it. It's usually somebody in close relationship or a fiduciary relationship who takes advantage of that relationship and victimizes someone in any kind of way, major kind of ways and minor. But what also is known is that it's often repetitive because it's within a relationship. It can be very entrapping for the individual. And when I first started my work, which Sandy mentioned about incest, it was the family context that we were talking about, and it was happening to children. But some of the evolution that's going on in the understanding of complex trauma is it's not just childhood trauma. It can occur at different times. But what we have learned is when trauma occurs in childhood, trauma of this sort, it has very many implications for the individual's identity and for developmental consequences across the lifespan. And one of the primary after effects has been found a propensity towards re-victimization. And that's not blaming the victim. It's that the victim has adapted to repetitive injury and therefore is rather blinded to it. So part of the treatment is to unblind them, which unfortunately can be very, very painful, as you can imagine, as you look at betrayal, but also getting beyond that. And so it can be, for some individuals, lifelong, and it can involve layered trauma, starting originally in childhood. Now, what has happened recently in the evolution of understanding complex trauma is that it can occur at any time over the lifespan, meaning it can start at any time. And as we've been looking at things like climate disaster and things that were formerly not so, were seen as impersonal disasters, we're now identifying that they're complex in terms of many of them have repetitive elements, and many of them have, some human causation as part of them. So we have a much broader understanding of what what constitutes complex trauma. And to the list that you provided, Sarah, early on about the 4 elements, I would add one more, and that is that an individual's identity is often, especially when it starts young, but can happen at any time, there's challenges to the individual's identity. And Judy Herman, who wrote the classic book, Trauma and Recovery, talked about deformation of identity. And that is a huge loss because the individual's identity development has been derailed through complex trauma. And another thing having to do with the treatment process is often when the trauma was in childhood, it is disconnected, it's distal trauma, and the individual doesn't connect the current symptoms that they're having, whatever they're having, with what happened to them. So I've also written a book, and Sandy and I have really emphasized the idea of trauma informed is it's not you, because what happens is there's an internalization of the victimization or the non-protection in the victimization, but it's what happened to you. So it shifts the lens into one of understanding something happened to you. And as Sandy said, you adapted to it and it became what you knew. And so treatment is geared towards providing a lot of education and sort of reestablishing and developing that understanding is it's not you, it's what happened to you. And then what you said about hope is something that I tell clients all the time, that I will hold the hope because I know that there's hope for recovery, and they can recover personally and socially, but they may need a lot of help in understanding that, which is again understandable. So I hold the hope, and I hope over time that they're going to embrace that and be motivated to change now that they know that there's a process for change.
You know, what's been disturbing is that we know now where it's coming from, and yet for a lot of people that try to get help, they're going to get a number of diagnoses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can
Yep.
you put that together for us? Like what's the problem there?
Well, the problem is that that people with PTSD, and now we have a diagnosis of complex PTSD that has to do with this type of traumatization. The problem has been understanding that complex trauma and PTSD, regular PTSD, has many different types of comorbidities or co-occurrences, and that's been hard to put under an umbrella. And the original diagnosis was developed as an umbrella diagnosis to hold all of these things. But I'm going to get on my bandwagon here. There's not been a lot of training in professional training about trauma and traumatization and the difference between standard PTSD and complex PTSD, because there seems to have been resistance to really looking what happens to children who have been traumatized. There's been a disconnect there some way, and it continues. And there's a lack of education. And I get called, and you probably do too, all the time from individuals saying, you know, I can't find anybody who knows anything about complex trauma, or they've never heard of it before. It's
Yes.
getting more known since the diagnosis has been included and in the International Classification of Disorders, but it was not really understood. Also, these individuals have typically, especially women, been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and they're seen as, quote, bad borderlines who, you know, when we talk about hope, many of them face clinicians who tell them that there's no hope of their recovering because they're borderline. Well, we're reconceptualizing it and seeing it from another lens. They may have borderline characteristics, but those are often adaptations to what was happening to them. And if we look at them from that lens, it makes their difficult behavior often understandable and treatable. And
What
we
are
have,
some of the, oh, sorry.
that's okay. We have
What are
new,
some of the differences in treating adults, children, adolescents, and even whole families?
well, they have to be treated obviously with their age and stage and their degree of understanding. I also have co-authored a book on treating complex trauma in children and adolescents, and we really paid attention to that. There have been fewer methods that have been tested out for children and adolescents. That's changing. But the foundation of all of this is education. And when you're treating a family, and I've always been amazed by this, you can talk to parents and, they have no comprehension of what might be a traumatization of their children. And when children exhibit some of the symptoms, they don't recognize them as having anything to do with trauma. So we're learning about that too. And let me just give the example of kids who are bullied. That's a very serious form of complex trauma that if parents don't know about it or are not on top of it, when the kid starts to become symptomatic, they don't know what they're seeing. So it's important that we keep getting the message out there that trauma is often at root of what are seen as, untoward behaviors, oppositionalism, defiance, ADHD at times, it's misdiagnosed often, bipolar disorder. So we need to keep educating at the elementary level and also the social level.
Yes, because I think really people don't understand that the message has not gotten out about what this is all about.
Yeah.
Are you seeing that change?
To some degree. The thing that is disconcerting at times is organizations are saying that they're trauma informed and that their staff are trauma informed, but sometimes it turns out to be just advertising and it's not actually working the way it's supposed to. So trauma informed means that we take it into account and we don't just ignore it. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be continued on that.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay. Thank you. I'm glad to join you.
It was great to see you.
Yeah, we want to thank you for listening to Creating Presence. We just spoke with Dr. Christine Courtois. Coming up after the break, we'll speak more about emergence and evolution with our returning guest, Yates Sexton, and with Jesse Kohler, Executive Director of the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. We'll be right back after these messages.
If you would like your organization to be aligned in its values, practices, and skills to be trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, and trauma-resilient, Creating Presence is the program you are looking for. The Creating Presence model is an online and coach certification program authored by internationally renowned Dr. Sandra Bloom. This program is designed to help your organization become certified as a safe and value-aligned place for both your staff and clients. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, the host of this broadcast. For more information as to how your organization can create presence, go to creatingpresence.net. Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. Sandy, Sarah, and their guests will discuss strategies and innovative practices for restoring our collective social health.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And we want to welcome our two guests. One is returning guest, Yates Sexton. And Jared is a prolific American author, political analyst, and co-host of the Muckrake podcast. His most recent book, The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis, is a must-read. Hi, Jared.
Hi, how's it going, everybody? It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. We are also welcoming Jesse Kohler. Jesse is the Executive Director of the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, and we'll let him tell you what that's all about. Together, they are developing a strategy for de-radicalizing the discourse that's come to characterize American society through trauma-informed, compassionate, and meaningful conversations with individuals and groups who feel voiceless in this current social climate. Welcome, Jesse.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be with all of you.
So Jess, tell us about CTIP, what it is.
Sandy, it is so humbling to be asked by you, one of the co-founders of CTIP, to describe the organization. But I think that right before break, what Chris was talking about as some of the issues that we see in the movement was one of the reasons that you and others saw a need to found this organization. And so we're really working while we understand and want to raise awareness of trauma at an individual level, certainly. We are also working to raise it at an organizational level, at a systems level, and build the movement to really get diverse lived experience, community context, different voices involved in helping us shape the many ways that trauma shapes our society and promote trauma-informed approaches at an individual, systemic, organizational level moving forward. And so we certainly do policy work, and we also try to promote community evolution to have a grassroots strategy as well as a grass top strategy. And with that top-down, bottom-up approach, we believe that where they meet in the middle is where flourishing is going to occur for our society. And that's really what we're working on at CTIP.
Jared, tell us about how you and Jesse got connected and what concerns inspired you to start this project together.
Well, I think like most people who are working on these things, we were introduced by Sandy and basically put in touch that way. But what happened was that as I was studying radicalization within the United States, and this is political, cultural, you name it, what I came to realize is that there was something happening underneath the surface that wasn't being identified, right? Like all the conversations are about what, say, political figure X says or what political figure Y says and like what that does and how it resonates. But that's not actually what's occurring. What's actually occurring is an invisible world of motivations and conscious and unconscious ideas about how politics should work and how culture should work. Once I started to realize the psychological and traumatic aspects of this, I realized, oh, this is the secret. It was like looking in a microscope for the first time and seeing cells and realizing there's like an entire invisible world that is acting on all of this. And so eventually what happened was through talking to Sandy and through talking with Jesse, Jesse and I started to come to an understanding that there were only certain ways to handle this. You have to start dealing with the trauma and the conscious and unconscious motivators that are causing this radicalization, which unfortunately not a lot of people are really focused on right now. And this is sort of an untouched area that we've started to wade into.
Yay. I am so glad you two are doing this work. And how are you figuring out how to focus, what choices to make to even focus on such a huge social issue?
I think that, Jared, you can add on to this, but as Jared just described, I mean, Sandy, one of the big things that we sort of start with is, you use a term called a collective disturbance when there's sort of this momentum and atmosphere that is causing activity that goes unaddressed. And there are forces on every end of the political spectrum, really, that are kind of forcing anger, hostility across and at both sides that kind of distract from the things that we all agree on and need and can make progress on. And we start with that collective addressing what goes unaddressed so frequently about those forces that lie beneath the surface, really, of what we all see and end up talking about, regardless of which part of the political spectrum we come at this with. And then there's so much more, Jared, if you want to sort of go on from that.
Yeah, I think we started basically, we can talk about millions of people who disagree with each other. This is a very large country with a lot of people in it. But I think you have to start with the personal. And for me, it's like if you have a friend who's having a feud with another friend or a family member who's having a feud with another family member, what you recognize is that both sides are acting irrationally. There's something that isn't connecting. There's something that needs to be addressed. And in order to address the thing, you have to build trust, or you have to sort of work through all of these different narratives that we create for ourselves, right? And I think anybody listening understands this. Like we get in these places where parts of us make up stories about other people and we're suddenly not even talking to each other. We're talking past each other. And unfortunately, that's not a personal relationship we're talking about. We're talking about the United States of America. And so what we've been doing is we've been starting with that irrational behavior and trying to understand where it comes from, what the motivators are, and then eventually how we can restore a sense of rationality. And instead of it being a zero sum, the person on the other side of this conversation is evil and they're trying to destroy me, and in some cases they are trying to destroy you, you're trying to diffuse the situation and getting it to a point where we can start having rational conversations and living in something of a more of an objective reality from this standpoint.
Sandy and I have the privilege of often being invited in to organizations because they see a problem and are looking for a solution. In my experience, people who are really embedded in their radicalization, they don't really see a problem. They're not so interested in change. How are you finding entry points? Like what's the process that you're using or planning to use in order to even begin these conversations?
We started, I mean, where we began was where our network existed. And I think that there are advocates in particular at a state level who are facing really strong barriers to being able to make the changes that they are so passionate about making, and are experiencing incredible burnout as a result of just the reinforced strengthening of political boundaries and barriers that exist. And there was this incredible opportunity, because as a result of all of that, there are then the impacts of that is that there's this fragmentation and siloing throughout the field that is forcing people to feel even more isolated and lonely, that is further exacerbating the burnout that so many advocates are feeling and so many different organizations are facing. And, you know, CTIP has an incredible national network of people that are advocating all across the country who are coming up along these barriers. And while I think that our work, as it continues to grow, emerge, and evolve, will be able to, we will be able to have conversations with different types of people. We really found that entry point into the folks who are heading into a state legislative session, coming out of one that was very tough, looking for new opportunities and answers, and that there was already some of that trust built with at least some folks within that coalition that allowed for us to kind of get in the door and start to have these conversations. And those conversations, I mean, Jara, as much as I think folks did learn from us and that full day that we had, you know, we've learned so much from them as well. I mean, our understanding of what is going on has also been shaped as we've had more of these conversations, which just goes to show how important being able to have these dialogues really are.
Yeah, and to go ahead and jump off of that, you know, Sandy, you were talking earlier about how human beings are so quick to adapt to adverse conditions. One of the worst problems that has happened, and without getting into political specifics, over the last few years, things have gotten increasingly worse in a lot of different ways. And the people who have been subjected to that in many ways, and I'm not just talking about like, oh, I'm disappointed how an election went. I'm talking about violence. I'm talking about intimidation. I'm talking about like gleeful cruelty that has replaced anything even approaching discourse. What we're talking about here are groups of people who have been traumatized by the political and cultural trends in this country, and also economic trends for that matter. And so what has happened is that we have gotten to a point where people have gotten so used to how things have been that they have come not to accept what has happened, but to live within it. And so what we've been trying to do is to talk to anyone that we possibly can to say, hey, guess what? Life can get better. And I know it's frightening to get your hopes up. I know it's really terrifying in the face of adverse circumstances to get excited about what could possibly happen, but you're not going to move anywhere if you don't. And if we continue to live in a zero-sum society where either I win or you lose, and either you win or I lose, what ends up happening is that all of the possible outcomes get worse. And this radicalization that we're talking about continues. So what we're trying to do is talk to certain people as entry points so that they can learn how to have hard discussions and understand what other people are saying when they're actually talking about other things, radicalized ideas. And so what we're trying to do is to sort of massage the discourse on different sides so people can start to understand what people are actually saying when they're not even talking about the things that they're actually feeling, which is unfortunately what happens when you get into a traumatized state.
Yeah, exactly. The irrationality when you're confronted with somebody who you don't even know, it's almost like you're in foreign territory. You're not speaking the same language. That's what it feels like. Do you feel like you're making some progress with that? And if you are, how are you doing it?
Well, I'll go ahead and start, Jesse. I think one of the things that's happening here, like, so for instance, you can have rational conversations about all kinds of things, right? Like, what do we need to talk about in this country? Like, should we have cleaner air? Should public education, how should public education be funded, right? Like, how should we provide for people? How should we protect people? We're not having those conversations. And again, to make it personal, it's like when you're talking to somebody and they get into some sort of an irrational state where they're talking past you, right? They're talking about these other things that have nothing to do with the conversation. Unfortunately, that's intentional in this country. There are a lot of motivators and a lot of actors in this country that want to keep us from having rational conversations because the things we would talk about in a rational state, we kind of all agree on, right? We're just having conversations about things that we don't agree on as opposed to the things that we do. Where we have had advances is by making it clear that that has not happened by accident, that that's not just occurring. Like, the thing we came across when we started this work is you would hear from people, they would say, I thought I knew my neighbor. I thought I knew the people at my, my school board, and I realized I never knew them at all. And the truth is, something has happened in this country. It didn't just bubble up by itself. It's a long, long festering thing that has like boiled over at this point. So the places where I have felt hope is where we've been able to talk to people to remind them they deserve better. That's the first thing that you have to do. You have to remind them that they deserve a better life than the one that they have had so far and what they've been forced into. But the second thing is you don't have to play these zero-sum games. You can find the rational good part of them and you can have a conversation that can be productive. And Jesse, you can speak to it, but those are the points where I've felt the most hopeful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think about the activity that kind of ended, the one full day that we did where we created, I think that we called it the ideal agenda. And I think that at the end it was named like, we were in Iowa, and I think that it was called like the Iowa we deserve, or it was something like that. Jared, you would remember the exact wording maybe. But, having folks not just think about, the state legislature is attacking this one issue, and my organization is going to specifically focus on this one issue and safeguard against that, while the other more than dozen organizations had their same issue. That's that fragmentation and siloing that we were talking about. And instead, folks came together and were like, there are these things that we all just agree on, and we can come strong as a united force, while also, to Jared's point about not having that zero sum, more of an abundance mindset, where we can go and advocate for that one piece while also advocating for the whole picture in unity, and then even have other organizations advocate for our thing as well. Jared, it looked like you have a point.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. One of the biggest problems that we have in this country is that we've been subjected to decades of being told that we can't have better things. Like, you better just be happy that you have what you have. And anyone who's been stuck in a dysfunctional relationship or situation understands that at some point or another, you start accepting scraps. The least that you can. So we've come to this point in this country where even the things that we've gotten in the past, it's like, well, just be happy you have what you have left. But that's not enough. What actually motivates people is when you get into that idea of having the life you deserve. The problem is that all of our systems have been programmed to tell us that we deserve less, that there's something wrong with us, that matter of fact, we wouldn't even know what to do with abundance. You should probably just accept the austerity that you have and just be quiet and hope that things don't get worse. The problem is that we've gotten caught in these really dysfunctional cycles because a sense of self-worth has been culturally, politically, and economically taken from us. And when you tell people, and Jesse, just very quickly, I think we both agree on this, watching the change in people when they are told that they deserve more and they're validated that they deserve more, it's the most hope that they've had in years, because what they've learned to accept is not just less, but that things are going to get progressively worse, so they need to lower their expectations.
Absolutely.
There were
That's why we've dropped down from being in the top 10 of the happiness scale globally to down to 23rd place. And that it sums up exactly what you're talking about. Jess, I interrupted you.
No, just like I think about the tears that were shed in that room, my own included, by the way. And like when we have these conversations, that you can see the hope and you can see how much pain is really bottled up by so many people. And I think that one of the other really hopeful parts is that when that conversation is able to happen, and there are so many barriers to having these sorts of conversations, people feel guarded, people feel protected, people feel like they can't be vulnerable. And we know how important that is to be able to be authentic. We see groups that then come away feeling united, feeling like they have friends, feeling less isolated, to take next steps together. And then that ability to circle back and continue to have conversation and move forward, not where everything was solved in a single conversation, right? But we had a conversation that we can come back to each other and have the next conversation as well and continue to grow. And all of that creates an incredible amount of hope and just shows how deeply embedded so much of this has become in each of us and in American society as a whole.
You're also really highlighting the focus on relationships. And when we're talking about trauma-informed practice, like that is primary. So Sandy and I are really excited to continue this conversation with you both. We want to thank you for listening to Creating Presence, and we will continue this conversation with Jared Yates Sexton and Jesse Kohler right after this break.
If you are a professional who would like to know more about how to provide care for individuals who have experienced trauma and adversity, Lakeside Global Institute can provide you with one of 2 intensive certification courses. You can be certified as a trauma-sensitive professional, which is a 50-hour online training experience. Or, for a deeper experience, you can become a Lakeside Global Institute certified trauma-competent professional through a live Zoom process that is 75 hours of well-researched and practically applied training. Lakeside Global Institute provides professionals with the highest level of training sophistication and integrity for you to be proficient in trauma-responsive care. You can learn more by going to lakesidetraining.org for more information. Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. Sandy, Sarah, and their guests will discuss strategies and innovative practices for restoring our collective social health.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And we're going to now continue our conversation with our guests, Jared Yates Sexton and Jesse Kohler.
So we left off talking about relationships. And that's really one of the things that is a primary focus in our model, in creating presence. Really kind of not just looking at what people do in order to make things better, but how they connect with each other and how to restore that sense of community and inspiration. So what are you both seeing with regard to relationships?
Well, I'll go ahead and start, Jesse, and you can jump off. I'll say that I have learned that there are many different ways of communicating and forming relationships. One way you can do that is by abusing and traumatizing the other person, motivating them through fear, right? Finding what control levers can make them like really, really be afraid and uncomfortable. That can yield results, but over time it turns into a really corrosive, awful situation with consequences that are often unseen. Politics have been, like, filtered through that, for a long time. I mean, American politics have always been about control from the very beginning. How can the elites make sure that the people underneath them, do what they want them to do, whether it's through not allowing them to vote or by manipulating them through educational or propaganda, however it works. What I wanted to do and what Jesse wanted to do through this is to start coming in good faith. Because a
Mm.
lot of political consultants and analysts, they're always what they're actually talking about without realizing it is they're talking about abusing people. They're talking about manipulating people, telling them something and then making them do something else. And when that has that mystification around it, people can feel it. One of the reasons we're in the political situation we are now and cultural situation is because people have known their entire lives that they've been lied to and manipulated and taken advantage of. And by the way, that opens the door for other people to take advantage of them and abuse them. So one of the things that we've had to be able to do, and Jesse, this is like one of the entry points of this. Even the people we're talking to have had so many people show up trying to sell them products, trying to fleece them, trying to take this money and do that. What you actually have to do is you have to keep creating good faith relationships that then create good faith relationships, which I happen to think is the only antidote to generations and centuries of manipulation and abuse.
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
I had a light bulb go off, and what it reminded me of is when we are working with organizations, we often really try to help them understand that, a traumatized brain is going to lean towards communication that's about survival. And it's either going to be about power. How do I get it? How do I keep it? How do I make sure no one steals it from me? Or we end up focusing on fairness, right? This isn't fair. This person has more than I do. And sort of going back to what you were saying about, when we get conditioned to accept scraps. And the antidote that we focus on in our work with creating presence is really about shared interest, like really shifting the conversation from language that focuses on power or just about fairness to really understanding like what is in our collective best interest. And it sounds to me like that is also really a parallel in what you're both doing in these conversations.
That was a big part of what we talked about, right? We were pretty explicit that when we get into stressful or traumatized situations, right, we know from that simplified brain model, right, that we really get focused away from our cortex, away from that long-term thinking and planning and complex thought area toward fight, flight, freeze in the midbrain. And using a tool from Dr. Bruce Perry, the 3 R's of regulate, relate, and reason, which having worked with presence, you all came in and worked with CTIP and kind of organizationally supported our being able to regulate first within the workspace, relate to each other, and then reason. We're kind of trying to do the same thing just across political conversations because, like Jared was saying, we've been so systemically, it's almost like psychological warfare, like this is intentionally done, where we have been forced in away from complex thought, being able to have really complex conversations and almost just talking points because we're mirroring what we hear from outside instead of really integrating in really deep, thoughtful, critical ways the sort of conversations that we're trying to have, that then to go through those, we need to create relationships before we can go to that logical point of reasoning, which Jared alluded to earlier as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
we have.
just well, I just want to jump off that very quickly because this is one of the things that once I understood it, you see it everywhere, right? Because all of this it all comes down to trauma. Because like you said, organizations, what you do is you go in and you talk to them and you suddenly realize there was a moment of trauma that all of the distrust and all of the dysfunction has originated from. People understand that intuitively. But when it comes to politics and when it comes to these efforts that we're talking about, people have not understood that, right? Because you have a side that says, we are trying to talk rationally to these people and they will not listen to us. We have the facts. We know what's good for them. We know what's good for, and at that point, you're like, this is about control. And you're trying to talk rationally to people who are not in a rational state. And when you start to say, hey, by the way, you're not in a rational state either. You're using rational ideas, but you're using them in a weaponized fashion. We need to talk about what you're feeling, what your traumatic state was, get you in a rational state where you can talk to people and see beyond what they're saying and what they're doing and understand where these things come from. And this is interpersonal relationships. It just so happens, it starts here and then it branches out and suddenly millions of people are involved in familial communal relations with each other. So what we've had to do is start to say, it's not enough for you to say, this is good for your children. Because what have we seen in this country? We have seen that people will sacrifice their children's better future and their safety and their lives for irrational reasons. So you can't go ahead and make that appeal. You have to somehow or another bring them into a more rational state and move beyond these things, which is not what we're taught to do. We're taught to crush these people. We're taught to beat them at the ballot box, laugh at how they feel, and then move forward. And that unfortunately has gotten us to where we're at.
Yep. Yep. What strategies are you guys using to have these conversations? Because there might be people out there who want to try their hand at doing what you're doing, but not have a clue how to even get the conversation started.
Two things that Jared, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, so two things that Jared just said that I think are really important. From Jarretttown Elementary School, one of the things that I learned is that when you're pointing one finger at someone, you got three pointing back at you, right? And that ability for all of us to see that we're kind of caught in this together, even if we're on different sides, and just have that space to just reflect on how we are processing through these things and how we may be perpetuating subconsciously some of these dynamics and very complex dynamics that we are caught within is really important. That's where that level setting, removing the collective disturbance of like, here's what's going on. It's not really any one individual actor's fault. It's kind of these systemic forces that we get caught in and then perpetuate ourselves. I think that that's really important. And then the other piece that Jared just said of like, look, if someone's coming at us with an emotional narrative, coming at us from their limbic brain, and we're trying to come at them from the cortex with logic, we are only going to further dysregulate and remove the ability to get to logical conversation.
We're both going to be in our limbic system.
And
right?
so, exactly, or lower. But
Or lower.
We need to, and this is where I spoke about vulnerability earlier, and that is tough. We need to create conditions of safety and empowerment, which we try to create containers for, but throughout our society is broadly not done, certainly not for everyone in our society to safely speak. But that ability to be vulnerable and authentic about what's our emotional reality and connect with someone on that human level. And when we can get there, then some of the logic can come up. But that ability, like Jared was just saying, to start with that emotional narrative, to be authentic about, well, I hear how you feel, and here's how I feel. And to sort of be able to see each other there instead of talking past each other with just the traditional things that we hear in the media that are just trying to get political wins without dealing with the substance of the issue of our lives are really important, necessary things to enhancing our democracy in terms of making our country better.
So two quick things on that note I just want to point out, which I find important. One, and this isn't something that we make explicit, but I think is at the heart of all of it, which is people get caught in their roles. And what have we found in this country is we have found that, and I'm not going to name names, but on one side of a political spectrum, we have aggressors. We have people who are being gleefully cruel and abusive. The other side, unfortunately, has learned how to have their control, which is I may not win, but I'm in the right. It's a righteousness that comes away from the situation. Unfortunately, that doesn't win a lot of elections and it doesn't win a lot of arguments, right? So instead, we have this situation where people walk away and they say, well, I didn't win, but I won, right? Which actually does not work when we're talking about political coalitions. The second thing, and this is unfortunate because if we were talking about abusive situations, we would often say, hey, go away from it. Get away from it, get it out of your life. That doesn't work when it's a politically and culturally abusive situation. You cannot just opt out, particularly in times of crisis. So what can we say? We can say, okay, you have to talk to this person who has been taught by political figures and media figures to be abusive. You have to change the way that you hear it and the way that you take it. Because what we've been taught, and this is unfortunately on both sides of the political spectrum, we've been taught to get those sweet, sweet dopamine hits. We want to see our enemies hurt. Unfortunately, that only makes the situation worse and it doesn't build anything further. So we have to talk, going back to what Jesse said about emotional narratives, we have to learn to see those and hear what's being said that isn't being said so that you can start to find some rational sort of discourse.
I want to ask too. I'm thinking back to what Chris Courtois was saying in our first segment about how trauma really shapes our identity, and it sounds like you are also experiencing this connection around what's happened that's kind of created this identity for people on all sides, both sides of this spectrum. How are you taking into consideration this idea of, you described it as like people who have felt voiceless, and it almost feels to me like that's part of an identity. What's been your experience with it?
Well, you can't go around this country without noticing how people are coping with a sense of powerlessness. It's people are acting as if they're like warriors, and like they're individuals and they make all the choices, which, by the way, helps explain America's love affair with guns. It's the idea of, oh, I'm not powerless. I'll show you how powerful I actually am. And what do we know about anger? Anger is the last bastion of a desperate person who has no ability whatsoever to communicate. We live in a time where people feel powerless because, in large ways, they are powerless. They're being told to feel powerful through consumer means, through political means, by being violent, by being abusive. We can see these things and understand where they come from. The problem is when we don't look for that and we don't understand the motivators. And instead, we just say, oh my God, the people next door to me are demons. Instead of they are people who have gone through something and unfortunately are acting out through their trauma.
And I know that we're wrapping up here, so I'll just say, and Sandy, I'm going to mimic back something that you've kind of implemented into CTIP, is that we see democracy as an antidote to trauma, right? Bringing up that diversity of lived experiences and respecting and honoring people's lived experiences across this very diverse country, right? And having those people be able to make meaning of their experiences and communicate that in a unified and integrated narrative, and then also to use those experiences to help shape systems over time in ways that perpetuate less harm, that promote well-being. And what I think Jared and I agree on, and so many others, is, America has all of these points of propaganda: liberty and justice for all, democracy. And how we get there is by honoring and recognizing different people's experiences. And that is the process that we're trying to enable, that we are trying to, again, create those conditions of empowerment and safety, one conversation at a time, that then, like Jared talked about, have these ripple effects that create a more functional democracy, both big D democracy as well as small d democracy. And again, getting back to the work that you all do with presence at that organizational level and embedding organizational democracy where it's possible, is so important as we continue to navigate and find answers to the questions, to getting back to Chris's point from earlier, how do we really integrate a truly trauma-informed approach? And it's got to start by hearing people and by honoring the traumas and pain that have been perpetuated in an individual, familial, community, organizational, and systemic level.
And there's one word I wish we could bring back into our everyday vocabulary, and it's kindness.
Yep.
And my favorite mystery writer is Louise Penny, and her characters are about and talk openly about just being kind. And that's kind of what you've been really, that's the overarching thing that we're all up against, is that you talk about it, Jared, it's cruelty. And it's just such profound unkindness, a lack of just simple respect for other people and listening to where other people are at. It's time to bring it back. And that's why I'm glad we have a platform that we can hear from you guys and talk about it.
It's interesting, Sandy. I'm thinking too about the organizations that I'm working with in coaching. And I think sometimes just creating the space for people to be together and see each other as humans and even have really hard conversations, but to do it in a way that creates safety instead of more trauma. It's one of the biggest pieces of value that we also bring in this work. Jared, Jesse, thank you both so much for being on the show, and thank you so much for inspiring our listeners. Join us next week for our final chapter of this series as Sandy and I review what we've learned and what we've thought over the last several months as we've done this podcast. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.